Hi, I'm Erin Spain. Welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to show you how I built this DIY desk with welded steel legs. This was such a fun project and I'm so excited to share it with you because I'm just now getting back into welding, which is something that I learned a couple years ago, but I haven't done much of it, so I'm still a total beginner. So this was a really fun challenge for me. I do realize that most of you probably don't weld, and that's totally okay. If you want to make this project, you can always order prefabricated metal legs online. I often use hairpin legs, so I'll link to the ones I usually use in the description box below. Or you can make your own wooden legs. It's totally up to you to get as creative as you want. If you have any questions for me, please leave those in the comments section, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel and click the bell to be notified of my future videos. All right, let's get started. Before I started this project, I literally sat on my living room floor and 3D modeled it with whatever I could find, which in this case was little artist paintbrushes. I just wanted to get an idea visually of what configuration would look best for the legs. Next, I cut some 2-inch wide flat steel bar into 8 pieces at 13 inches each for base plates for each leg, so 2 for each leg. I used my portable bandsaw to cut the steel and applied some lubricating wax to help keep my blade from overheating. Then I used my angle grinder with the flap disc to grind the edges and also any area on the surface that I would end up welding. You absolutely have to have a clean surface to weld, so it's important to grind off all the residue and grime. Raw steel is very dirty and greasy. You can also wipe it down with acetone, which I did when I was done welding everything before spray painting, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. I positioned one bar perpendicular to the other, forming a T shape. Then I welded it together with my Forney Easy Weld 140 MP welder. I'll link to it in the description. It's a great machine for a beginner, and it can do MIG, TIG, and flux core, so lots of options. I tack welded each end and then connected those with a bead running the length of the seam. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, I do have a blog post for beginner welders, and I talk about how I learned and some of the basics of welding, and I will link to that for you. But basically a tack weld is just sort of a little dot to hold it together. Next, I flipped it over and welded the other side. I used my angle grinder to grind my weld smooth on one side, since that side will lie flush against the bottom of the desk. I wasn't as worried about the other side since it wouldn't be visible. And let me just add a disclaimer right now, I am a total beginner and my welds are sloppy, especially when I was welding the steel rod, since this is literally my first time ever welding those, so please withhold judgment. I repeated this whole process 4 times so that I had 4 T-shaped bases. Next, I cut my 1/2 inch thick steel rod into 2 pieces at 25 inches long and 1 piece at 26 inches long for each leg. So you'll have a total of 8 25-inch pieces and 4 26-inch pieces. Then I cleaned up the ends of each rod with my angle grinder. I sat my base upright and used my magnet clamps to hold it in place, and then I formed a V shape with my 25-inch rods, placing them about 1.5 inches in from each edge. I tack welded each point and then went back in and finished welding each rod in place. Then I flipped it upright again so I could weld the other side. Then I placed my 26-inch rod diagonally from the center of my T to the center of my V-shaped rods. I just sort of eyeballed what position looked best. I didn't really measure the distance. And then I tacked it in place and then finished welding it in place. I made sure to match the angle with the other 3 legs as I made them. And then I repeated the process on all of the legs. Next, I cut 8 more rods at 15 inches long each, 2 for each leg, placing one end of each rod on either side of my center rod and then diagonally connecting them to each side of the V-shaped rods. Again, I tacked them in place and then welded them together and repeated this process for each leg. I did try to cut the ends at a little bit of an angle just so they would be easier to connect, but I did not do math on that. I did not figure exact angles, I just eyeballed it. I used my angle grinder to attempt to clean up and smooth all of my welds, although they're still pretty sloppy, but it didn't fall apart, so I'm fine with it. I decided to add a couple more rods to create more of a crisscross, so I cut 8 rods at 15.5 inches long, 2 for each leg, and connected them diagonally in the opposite direction as the other set of rods. Before painting, I wiped down each leg with acetone just to get rid of all the grease and grime. I sprayed them with Rust-Oleum Rusty Metal Primer. I meant to pre-drill holes before painting, but I forgot, so I did it after the primer dried. I used a multi-material drill bit made for drilling into metal, and I drilled holes in each end of the T-shaped bases so that I could easily attach them with screws from underneath the desk. After that, I spray painted them metallic gold. After the legs were all done, it was time to turn my attention to the desktop. Okay, yes, I did use this horrible junky plywood for the bottom, but let me explain. I wanted to use materials I already had on hand, and quite frankly, I didn't feel like buying another 8-foot sheet of plywood, so I used nicer hardwood plywood for the top, but I didn't have enough for the bottom too, so I just used this junky plywood that comes sanded on one side. I knew I was going to paint it anyway, so I wasn't overly concerned, but obviously if I wasn't challenging myself to save money and use what I had on hand, I would have used better materials. Anyway, I cut it to 4 feet by 22 inches using my handheld circular saw. Then I cut my remnant of hardwood plywood to the same dimensions to use for the top. For the sides and divider partitions, I used my miter saw to cut 1x3 boards into 4 pieces at 28 inches long each. Next, I used my Craig jig to drill pocket holes along one side of each of my 1x3 boards. Shout out to Craig for sending me this upgrade. It is the K4 Master System and I love it. Then I sanded everything smooth with my orbital sander. I swapped out my pocket hole drill bit with the driver bit that came with the kit. I attached the 1x3 boards with 1¼ inch pocket hole screws. As for the divider partitions, I determined the length I wanted my drawer to be, so about 15 inches, and then centered it and used it as a guide for where to position the divider partitions. Then I attached those using pocket hole screws as well. I'm working upside down right now, so I have the top of the desk face down on the ground, and I'm installing these with pocket hole screws so you won't be able to see them from the top side of the desk. Next, I made my drawer using 1x3 boards and a piece of a project panel I had on hand, which I used for the drawer bottom. I cut 2 pieces at 22 inches long each. I didn't need the drawer to be as deep as the desk just because it was excessive and I don't need that deep of a drawer, but you could modify this however you choose. And then I cut 1 piece at 13 inches long for the back piece, and I cut my project panel to 13 inches by 21¼ inches. I drilled pocket holes in each end of my 22-inch long pieces and then around the perimeter of my bottom project panel piece. I did use my hand planer to shave off a little bit from each 1x3 piece just so it wouldn't be too tight of a fit once I attached the bottom of the desk, so I shaved off about 1/8 inch. I assembled the drawer using 1¼ inch pocket hole screws, and I made sure to leave a 1/2 inch of space on each side of the front piece to allow for the drawer slides. Before assembling the desktop, I primed it and then later painted it white. I I wanted the drawer to have a secret compartment, so I cut a 1x2 to 13 inches long and then sanded out a notch with my Dremel Micro. I first tried to do this with a Forstner bit and then a spade bit, but that did not work out well, so I should have just done this from the start. Then I attached it a few inches from the back of the drawer using magnetic touch latches. You could use any type of magnets, but I had some of these left over from another project, so I just used these. I used a lucite and brass drawer pull that I had in my stash and just measured and marked so it would be centered and then drilled holes. Okay, I'm not even going to pretend that it didn't take me hours to get these drawer slides installed correctly. There is a reason why most of my furniture pieces don't have drawers. I am not a fan of installing them, but it was worth it in the end. After priming, I added edge banding to the exposed plywood edges. Now, I would have done this before priming, but I hadn't received the edge banding in the mail yet, and I had a deadline and I wasn't sure if it would arrive in time, so I started painting, but thankfully it arrived and I ironed it on. This stuff is super easy to apply. The glue is activated by heat, so you just use an iron to attach it, and then you can use a utility knife or a sander to clean up the edge. So after that was attached, I painted everything white. After the paint dried, I attached the bottom. Remember, we're still working upside down here, so I pre-drilled holes with a countersinking drill bit and attached it with 2-inch wood screws. I brought the whole desk inside to assemble the legs just because I was afraid I wouldn't be able to fit it through the doorway, and that was it. This was a really fun yet challenging build, and I'm so glad I did it. I will link to everything I used as well as my blog post in the description box below. And now for the outtakes. Okay. Whew, what is the deal here, stupid thing? Oh, jeez. Realized that this hair is driving me insane. Freaking airplane, really. Okay. Jeez. Okay. Let me just get interrupted one more time. Thanks so much for watching. You can find me online at erinspain.com and on social media at erinspainblog. In the meantime, please enjoy some of my other videos. Thanks.